everyone, and welcome back. This week we're going to be looking at the history of pajamas, and especially some of the changes that they went through in the 19-teens and 1920s. This video was originally intended to be all about 1920s underwear, the negligees and lingerie, and kept coming across all of these different references to all these different garments that I want to make, which will be another video. However, I also kept coming across pajamas under the terminology of lingerie and undergarments. And there seemed to be a lot of discussion about pajamas during this era. So I was curious and did the thing that I don't know if I should always do or should never do, and simply Googled the history of pajamas because I was curious. I don't actually know specifically where pajamas originated, how we got to the point that they are today, when they were popularized in certain ways. And well, not surprisingly, the things I was finding gave me kind of a good, really basic overview to start with. They also gave me something that concerned me, and that's the fact that they kept claiming that pajamas were popularized by Coco Chanel in the late 19-teens or 1920s, depending on which reference you're looking at. Some said in 1918 she started wearing beach pajamas and everyone went wild and then they just took off. So they kept basically attributing the popularity of modern pajamas or pajamas as more than just sleepwear to Chanel. And this mostly got me interested because, one, this seems a great example, potentially, of what I like to call the Beau Brummell effect, which is where we attribute a large societal fashion change to one person because it's easier. Also because I'd already done a fair amount of research into that era's pajamas, and I had never seen Chanel come up. Aside from, just happened to be talking about in the same article, but never in reference specifically to pajamas in the 19-teens or 20s. So I was pretty skeptical, but it is much easier to prove something is true than it is to prove that something isn't true. So this is gonna take a little bit more than just, oh, I didn't see anything. We're going to have to look at the actual history of pajamas, where they came from, how they changed and adapted over the centuries. This admittedly does take me a little bit outside of my comfort zone. I have really been studying fashion history for about 20 years. It is a brand new field. It's really only existed vaguely since the 1990s, so there's not as much easy resource material to do the research as there are in other well-established fields of history and other things. So there's a lot of scavenging for whatever primary resources you can and trying to fill in with a lot of time spent understanding cultures and regions and time periods and so much other stuff. And that is a lot of effort and time that I wish I had more of in order to do more. But so far, my research has been pretty much limited to the languages that I speak, which is English and French, and the culture that I'm familiar with, and the little bit of time period that I've been able to look into, which doesn't go back much further than the 17th century. So when I start moving into garments like this, where we're going to go pretty far afield, I am going to try and do my best at this, but if I don't give as much information as you were hoping for, it's because I just don't know yet. And hopefully I can do more research, and if you have places to point me for any more information about any of this, I would love to keep digging into it. But we have to go pretty far back and pretty far from where I'm accustomed to start our journey with pajamas. Admittedly, trying to find all of the primary source material and secondary source material that I could possibly scrounge together for these sorts of research videos, I sometimes end up pretty far afield. And that is why I am really thankful the sponsor for this week's video is NordVPN. NordVPN is a virtual private network that keeps you safe on the internet both at home and far away. They encrypt your data and hide your IP address, which not only means that you can use public Wi-Fi safely, but it opens up a literal world of content to you. I spend a lot of time on Pinterest when I do research, and not all of the links provided are active or correct anymore. So often I wander into places that I didn't intend to be, and NordVPN makes sure that that doesn't become a big problem. They've added threat protection which blocks intrusive ads, while also making sure that you don't download malware. Even the safest places love to track what you're looking at. that. You know I'd be getting nothing but advertisements for pajamas after this video. And threat protection keeps that information private. On top of all that, you can connect back home no matter where you are in the world. Traveling abroad and finding out your favorite show, your favorite platform isn't available where you are is no fun. So now I can be thousands of miles away and still watch the shows that I like a normal healthy amount whenever I want. Just open up the map, click on a location, you'll be connected in seconds. And it's easy to use, connecting with one click or even auto-connect. And it's available on Windows, Android, iOS, macOS, and Linux. The best thing is right now you can go to nordvpn.com/Nicole Rudolph to get a huge discount on a 2-year plan plus 1 additional month free. And you won't have to worry about where your rabbit hole searches take you next. Thanks again to NordVPN for sponsoring this week's video, not only keeping my search efforts safe, but also allowing me to connect to lots of new places around the world, because that really is the point of today's video. The history of pajamas takes us back pretty far, because pajamas weren't really a typical Western garment until the 19th century. So in order to find the origins of them, we have to go back to India, Turkey, Iran, Japan, China, and really just about anywhere else. The actual term pajamas does come from India and that region. It is first recorded, as far as I could find, as early as the 16th century when the Mughals invaded India and brought with them this particular garment. And it is actually a combination of 2 separate words, pai, or sometimes I found it written out as ipai, and jama. So the first portion, pai, refers to leg, ankle, somewhere in that region coverage, and the second part, jama, can be used generally as clothing, but it can also refer to a specific coat garment. So essentially what it is a combination of 2 garments that go together. The features that define the jama are the fact that it is snug around the chest, the sleeves are long and fairly fitted, it has a very full skirt. The actual length of the skirt does change through history and from different culture to culture, because this garment wasn't just in one small region, it was fairly broadly adapted, so it is going to vary in its appearance to some extent. Earlier on, it was a shorter length, eventually it gained length, became a much longer, very full garment, and it's not to say that you don't still see the shorter lengths, you also will still see it sometimes being tucked up, so it makes activity levels a little bit more easy. One of the really distinct features of it, though, is the fact that it ties over the side of the chest. It is not a center front opening, nor is it a complete side opening. That defines it slightly differently, but it is sort of that mid side of the chest. And it has so many different varieties because it can be done in a lot of different fabrics. It's going to depend on the weather and what you need out of it. So you'll see really heavy wools all the way through incredibly elaborate gold encrusted and extremely heavy versions to very lightweight and nearly diaphanous muslin. So the whole range of fabric options is available depending on what you need, and it's worn by both men and women. I definitely found a lot more imagery that portrayed men rather than women. The ones that I did find of women, they tended to be in the more diaphanous styles, but everything that I found specified that it was not a specifically gendered item. The reason why it is a 2-piece thing of pyjama is the fact that as you get to those sheerer styles, as you get to maybe even the shorter styles, you need something else with it. And that is where pai comes in. The lower half is taken care of by a trouser-like garment. There are a variety of different styles that I could come across. In general, they seem to be made fairly large and gathered in around the waist, though they can be very tight at the legs in order to, again, make sure you have plenty of movement, but not anything getting in the way. The popularity of this garment does kind of wax and wane in different areas and different time periods. Then there's not really one point where it suddenly disappears from fashion. It's sort of a gradual thing in the 19th and 20th centuries, which is to be expected. Things were going through a lot of changes at that time. And it becomes one of the garments that really catches the attention of the European audience in the 19th century, because in the mid-19th century, the rule of the East India Trading Company over India was falling apart, and there was a rebellion in 1857 and led to the British government taking over rule, and that meant that throughout all of this there were tens of thousands of British troops in India at any given time. And inevitably, as they went home, they brought with them some of the things that they experienced, some of the culture, the food, and some of the clothing. Not surprisingly, you first send British troops to an area that is not British weather, they're going to be dealing with the heat pretty poorly, and some of the things that they did were adapt some of the local clothing that worked pretty well for the weather. And that made it back home with them. Some of the garments that did were pajamas. And it just simply at that point got shortened and smooshed together into pajamas. And the thing is that they defined this not necessarily as being a specific garment from India. They quickly started defining it as something that is a two-piece ensemble of a casual nature, usually looser trousers, some sort of tied or unstructured coat design. This term was then applied to other garments from other areas, not just a variety of garments from India, but also garments from China and Japan, from Turkey and from Iran. So it sort of became a catch-all term for anything that vaguely resembled what we tend to think of in our modern minds as pajamas, the classic style. And this garment gained in popularity throughout the latter part of the 19th century as men's sleepwear. It wasn't entirely embraced instantaneously, most things aren't, and it could still cause a fair bit of scandal. I found one article from a woman saying that she was passing a hotel and noticed a man in what looked to be traditional Chinese attire standing in the window. She stared at him for a moment only to realize that it was an American man, which apparently greatly embarrassed her that she was staring at him, and she, very flustered, quickly looked away and kept walking. So there was an expectation that these garments would be around, but perhaps it was still a bit shocking to see them in any sort of public sense. But regardless of some of the early responses to it, its usage did continue to grow, and it became immensely popular as men's sleepwear. Once we reach the 1890s, that's when we start to include women. I could find references as early as 1892 for women starting to pick up men's pajamas and wear them as sleepwear. Now, of course, it did not take long for the clothing industry to discover this and to take men's pajamas and alter them into slightly more appropriate for women by adding a little bit of lace, a little bit of trim, perhaps a different floral fabric or some other more feminine design to these garments to make them slightly more acceptable, but women were finding them a great alternative to nightgowns for quite a few reasons. One article I found, however, did claim that it was going to be a very bad thing for women to start wearing pajamas because they would receive no sympathy wearing such a masculine garment, and in cases where perhaps they're caught in a fire, they would not be taken by the firemen first as they should be, but instead left behind till last because they resemble a boy. And the firemen wouldn't know that it's a woman. So, you know, the potential dangerous, deadly risks to pajamas, I suppose, according to this one article. Others, however, claimed pretty much the exact opposite, that pajamas are actually the perfect thing for emergencies, fires, and the like, because you could jump out of bed and run outside and not have to worry about covering what is basically underwear as a nightgown. So you don't have to grab a robe or anything else. You are acceptable under these circumstances in public. Now, granted, it was still completely unacceptable for them to be wearing them in public on the regular basis, and quite a few articles said it should be okay as long as they are contained only to nightwear. They don't make it into daywear. They don't end up being worn about the house during the day, and forbid that they ever make it into public on the streets. That would never happen. Women would never want to wear trousers. Drama. The Victorians, always drama. But the idea of this garment being more functional and practical while still managing to be fairly elegant and fashionable was gaining steam. And as we reach the 19-teens, well, there's one thing that really helps with this. World War I. It does push it forward in numerous ways, including women being more used to wearing trousers and work clothes of that type, but it also, more interestingly, in my opinion, comes in the form of that earlier emergency preparedness, where women who were encountering bombing raids in the middle of the night quite often had to get up and leave their homes for safety, and suddenly pajamas were a good way to do that. There were even advertisements for a specific brand made just for that purpose, saying that, you might have to leave the home at any moment's notice, and what are you going to do if you're in your nightgown? scandal. So that's a really interesting addition to the normalization of pajamas in more than just nighttime attire when it comes to European and American consumers. By that point, not surprisingly, pajamas were not just accused of replacing nightgowns, but they were also starting to be accused of replacing daywear items such as negligees, that they were starting to be worn about the house under casual circumstances. In general, the culture was becoming much more casual with its attire, so it's no surprise. Things like pajama parties started popping up, where groups of people, sometimes all women, sometimes men and women, would get together at a house for a fancy dinner, and once the dinner was over, would remove the fancy outfits and change into pajamas to spend the evening much more leisurely together. These were definitely in newspapers a lot. They apparently created a great deal of scandal from time to time, and more than a couple divorces hinged on the attending of pajama parties and the events that followed. With all of this, women's pajamas were, well, getting more and more extravagant. They were leaving behind the simplicity of a loose trouser and unfitted shirt and becoming rather elaborate. Really fancy fabrics and trims and lace and beads and just so much effort put into them that they really stopped resembling what we would consider pajamas and started resembling incredibly fashionable and honestly kind of formal daywear. They took influence from not just the current fashions that were surrounding them, but from fashions all over the world. China and Japan were particularly popular sources for embroidery motifs and cuts and designs, trimming and fastening styles. There was also a very large amount of exportation of pajama-like garments from both of those countries for the tourist trade, and those styles found their way not only into pajamas but into a huge range of garments in this era. Of course, it was not all respectful inspiration, and they definitely had an unfortunate tendency to take styles that were just kind of muddled together from lots of different cultures, not really knowing what they technically were sometimes, and just putting it under the broad term of Orientalism, which came with a whole lot of other baggage. Actually, I'm going to link a bunch of books below on that topic because I have at least spent some time there and have some good resources. But the Western market was at least aware enough of the source material that they acknowledged that these garments were worn as daily attire elsewhere in the world, which blurred the line between sleepwear and casual attire. And in reality, aside from the use of trousers for the women, the garments that were considered pajamas weren't that far off from the things that were acceptable to leave the house in. Great example of this comes from Rudolph Valentino, who in 1922 was actually on trial in the state of California under the charge of bigamy. His divorce had not fully finished and gone through when he went to another country and got married to someone else. And the thing was, it came down to when he was seen in the hotel back in California on their honeymoon, he was either wearing pajamas or, as they put it, a Chinese silk suit. And the thing was, what they did couldn't be prosecuted unless they had marital relations in the state of California. And since they supposedly slept in different rooms due to the woman being ill, the only way that they could prove something happened was if they could prove that he was seen walking around the hotel in his sleepwear, in his pajamas, versus wearing something that was understood to be acceptable for public consumption under certain situations. So it apparently hinged on this tiny little definition of the clothing as to whether it was publicly acceptable or not, as to whether he could actually be charged with bigamy or not. Spoiler alert, he was acquitted. That trial takes place at a time where, honestly, pajamas were already being disseminated out into public spaces, especially when it comes to the beaches of Europe. Some beaches started banning pajamas on the beach as of 1921, so they were already seeing problems before we made it well into the 1920s, before the beach pajama as a fashion item really even took off that much. They seem to have spread from Europe to America very quickly, and nowhere in any of this did I come across Chanel. I did find one article that talked about Deauville, which was a beach resort that was particularly popular with the very young and fashionable French crowd. And the article, quite comically, describes a large group of young people coming downstairs in their pajamas. The gentlemen were wearing pajama trousers with their suit jackets, and they all came down, had a meal, were quite distracting, and once they were done, they ran out to the beach, stripped off their pajamas to their one-piece bathing suits, and proceeded to spend the evening on the beach swimming, even having a small orchestra there to play, quote, sad music. Which, I don't know, the whole thing is a great visual, especially when you add in the fact that there was apparently a group of older women nearby that observed the whole thing and were quite vocal about their displeasure, but as both the articles I found noted, they did not get up and leave despite this. They stayed and watched the whole thing. It's just a beautiful picture. And Chanel, at the time, did have a shop in Deauville, and she was known to be part of that crowd from time to time, but she herself was not specifically mentioned. A famous actress of the time was, but her name did not come up. I did see one brief mention of Chanel's influence on pajamas. However, it was in reference to the fact that they were being made in the style that Chanel had made popular with coats that previous winter, which is, from what I could find, talking about the knitwear and sweaters that she really popularized at the beginning part of the 1920s. So that seemed to be her bigger influence on the style of beach pajamas that were coming out as much as anything else. She was known to wear them, but again, I didn't find anything that talked about her wearing them even. It was just secondary source material that I found mentioning that. But I didn't actually come across any references in what I was looking for specific to her wearing beach pajamas, so that comes from other probably private correspondence and other places I wasn't looking. But that was really all there was. So I started looking into how far back I could trace the claim that she basically popularized or even invented pajamas for the beach and made them common for things outside of sleepwear. I didn't find much until I reached the early 2000s. Pretty much everything in the 1920s was just talking about the long list of people that were influential on these styles. She was sometimes mentioned in those lists, but never singularly. And most of the claims that I saw came from 2015 and later, when there was a resurgence of pajamas as daily wear at that time, and so it kept getting brought up over and over again, and it was nearly always using the same verbiage. And the closest I could track that verbiage back to was a book that was from the early 2000s about just generically the culture of the 1920s and all the things that were happening. And while it was written by two historians, neither of them are fashion historians, and it definitely does show as you start to read the rest of the chapter on fashion, and there were claims like women left off their uncomfortable corsets entirely. Which, if you've been here for very long, I have issue with that. So I would generally take the stuff that comes out of that book with a grain of salt. The reality is that pajamas were already on their way to being a popular garment, not just for sleepwear, not just around the home, but for daily usage in casual situations. The entirety of American and European culture at that time was trending towards more casual clothing, trending towards more casual atmosphere, and it only makes sense that this garment became part of that, with or without Chanel's influence. They had existed as not sleepwear for centuries before they even made it to Europe in the 19th century, or became more than just sleepwear for Europeans in the 1920s. The actual history of pajamas is so much more interesting than simply attributing its popularity in modern day to one singular famous person, especially when that famous person has a very strong record of being racist, anti-Semitic, and homophobic. So maybe instead, we look at the much more exciting actual history and give credit to all of the variety of sources and inspirations that give us our garment that we have today that is so immensely popular and is just a regular part of our lives in so many ways, not just as sleepwear, but also today as practical and stylish everyday clothing.